And tonight we're going to turn our attention to aspects of gender and sexuality in the Hindu tradition, along with a few brief comments at the end related to Buddhism, but the focus tonight is going to be on Hinduism. So, as in all religions, and I don't know how many times I've said this, but I'll say it again, whatever you're talking about, here we're talking about gender relations, sexual behavior, influenced by different attitudes, opinions over space and time. So you always have to look at things in terms of the historical context, and context changes. So any topic you take in any religion, it's vast because these are very old traditions, and so you have a number of different attitudes over time and space. And so I'll try my best to look at historical context. So anything I say is wrong. By definition, I mean absolutely, because if I say it, there's always this, well, what about this? Or what about that? And therefore, in the Hindu tradition, you have what seemingly are a lot of contradictions. Well, tonight, we're going to look both at the Kama Sutra, which is sort of one real end of the erotic spectrum. The far end is asceticism, sadhus, sadhvis, who completely give up not only sexual life, but family life and wander. And those are all within one tradition. So it's just important to remember those sorts of things. Also, and this is also true, class is very important. Sexual mores differ generally between class. The wealthy classes tend to have more open sexuality, traditionally. The lower stick to a more traditional morality. For example, you will find polygamy amongst the aristocracy in most ancient cultures. Amongst peasants, no. Well, first of all, you can't afford more than one wife. But these are just things to keep in mind. So when I'm talking about the Kama Sutra, which was a very aristocratic document, and you'll see why, you can't apply that to village Hindus. So all these things come into play. That's why I said anything I say is kind of wrong in an absolute sense. Okay, so let's move back a bit. The origins of what we call current Hindu culture can be traced back to what is known as the Indus Valley Civilization, which was contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and ancient Sumerian civilizations. We're talking about 2000 BCE. Okay, so this is probably where we get a lot of the original ideas that develop into later Hinduism. We don't know a lot about the social views either of anything in this civilization because they found the language, but they haven't been able to interpret it. I mean, why were we able to interpret so much of Egyptian hieroglyphics? Do you know? Because there was something called the Rosetta Stone that was found, which had hieroglyphics next to a different language which was known. And therefore you could put the two together. We haven't found, the script here is called Linear B, and they haven't found anything like the Rosetta Stone. So we have examples of tablets, but we really don't know what they say. So what information has to come from artifacts. So they've been able to put some things together based on artifacts. And as a result of these artifacts, some scholars believe the civilization practiced fertility rituals related to mother goddesses. And this is based on things like this figurine that has been found, which was probably a fertility goddess. Now, how can we say that's a fertility goddess? Because we have comparisons from other cultures that we know were fertility goddesses and look quite similar. That's how a lot of information is put together, by the way. It's taking something you know and trying to compare it with something else to come to a conclusion. And those conclusions can be wrong. But the more evidence you have, the more sure. And there's been so they believe this was a fertility goddess. And that it was really the beginning of goddess worship in India, which we call Shaktism, or the power of the goddess. So this comes from, in addition, there are these, what we call sacred stones that have been found. We call betels. Do you notice anything about them? Many of them are phallic, okay, and we know in Hindu, in Shaivite religion, the phallus is a major symbol. But there's also, what are the rings? Those are called the yoni. Phallus enters yoni. Okay, so a number of these have also been found at the site. And so this is some reference that they were aware of these symbolically as having some sort of sexual reference. But really the first written evidence comes from a number of the ancient texts, Hindu texts. Now, I say written because originally they were oral, as are most ancient texts. They were memorized. But over time, and when over time we're talking about 600-700 years, when they were oral, they eventually become written. And so we have references in many of the ancient texts. For example, the 4 Vedas, which are dated somewhere around 1500 BCE. They contain a number of moral perspectives on sexuality and marriage, as well as a number of fertility prayers. Lots of prayers to get progeny. Progeny was very important. That's how you carried on your line. So we find a number of those. The epics, which come a little later, the 2 famous epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Some say, again, as early as 1500 BC, but probably more close to 1000 BCE. The Ramayana tells the story of the Hindu avatar Rama, thus Ramayana, and his conquest of an evil demon by the name of Ravana. And Sita, who is his wife, Rama and Sita become the ideal married couple for what marriage should be like in Hindu culture. Ravana steals Sita, takes her away to Sri Lanka. And so much of the epic is about Rama in all his journeys down to Sri Lanka to regain Sita, bring her back, etc. But there's all sorts of sub-stories in this. If you ever want a big read, get this. It's sort of like one of these TV soap operas that go on for years. But there's lots of references to marriage in the Ramayana, especially the ideal marriage. What an ideal husband should be, that's Rama, and what an ideal wife should be, that's Sita. And then the second epic, which is known as the Mahabharata, it deals with a famous Indian war. That's where Krishna appears. I'm not going to go into all that. But both support the view, that's what's important about these, that in ancient India, sex was considered a mutual duty between the married couple. Marriage was a duty, and sex was a duty in marriage. Each person was required to fulfill their function. The husband and the wife could pleasure each other equally, but only in private. You don't have public display of affection. And you'll still find that in India today, unless you're going to the Bollywood and the middle classes. But if you go into a rural area, you never see any affection between male and female displayed publicly. You won't find a male and a female walking around holding hands. Okay? These are private matters. I think we saw that in Islam as well. These are traditional cultures where these things are, you can have sexuality, etc., pleasure as much as you want in private. And that's why many of the conservative cultures around the world today look at our culture and go, wow, these things should not be public. In any case, so we find these in the epics. We also know from the epics that polygamy was allowed, mainly again for the aristocracy, again not different from most ancient cultures. And the rulers practiced it, we know that, while the common people tended to have monogamous marriage, often for economic reasons. Girls could only be married after they reached puberty, And child marriage was unknown early on. I mention that because later, in the medieval period, child marriage will become very prominent in India. But from the epics, we know that child marriage was not practiced. And the polygamy, and I think I mentioned this in terms of Islam and Muhammad, was often political in nature. Okay, you had more than one wife, not for romantic reasons, but mainly for political, families marrying into each other. Marriage to close kin is banned, which again, we find this across cultures. Even in Aboriginal cultures in Australia, one of the strong taboos, kinship lines, you can't cross certain lines. So there was an awareness early on, and people have speculated why, that too close marriages too close in the bloodline were not a good thing. And it may just well have been practical experience.
Didn't happen in the royal family?
No, it didn't happen in the... It did, yeah, but we look at Europe, for example. All the kings that are a little nutty. No, mentally ill. And it may well have been because of this intermarriage. Early on, there was complete freedom for both the boy and the girl in selection of their partner. This will change during the medieval period, when marriages will become arranged, and we'll talk about that later. We don't get any mention of divorce in any of these texts. So if you're a scholar and you're reading these texts, you see no mention of divorce, what might you conclude?
They don't want to talk about it.
Either they don't want to talk about it, or there was no such thing. I mean, it wasn't something that was practiced. Could be either, but most people feel divorce, and that's still in India today. To divorce is to leave your family, your kin, and do what? It's such a tight-knit social structure that if you moved out of it, that's why being outcast, throwing out of your caste is disaster. Where do you go? You go to the city, and in any case, so it's not mentioned. In fact, it only starts to be mentioned about this 3rd and 2nd BCE. So for 1,000 years or so, we've had no mention of divorce, then we find it. Nudity in art was considered acceptable in parts of India. This is a famous painting from the Ajanta caves. The Ajanta caves are some of the most amazing structures you'll ever find. They're in northern Maharashtra. Those are all hand chiseled out. I mean, you didn't have any way of digging that out except, and those are cliffs. And some of those caves go back in 100 yards. And there are temples inside. And there was lots of wall art. And you can see from this very famous painting, there was nothing seemed as shameful in showing in the body. So this was an example of nudity that started to appear about 100 years before 1 BCE, around just about the turn of the millennium. Homosexuality is not explicitly mentioned, but there's one passage in the Rig Veda which is very interesting. And it reads, and I'm going to talk more about this next week, because my whole class next week will be on homosexuality. But I just wanted to mention this. In the Rig Veda, there's this passage, Vikriti evam prakriti, which can be translated as, what seems unnatural is also natural. Which you could take in a variety of ways if you needed to interpret it. It's become one of the passages that the gay community in India has used to say that as far back as the Rig Veda, this wasn't seen to be unnatural. In any case, like I said, I'll talk a lot more about this next week. So somewhere between the 4th century BCE and the 2nd century CE, so that's somewhere 600 years. You see how difficult it is to date things when I've got to give you a possibility of 600 years difference. That would be what? That'd be like today, going back to 1400 or 1600. A text known as the Kama Sutra was written. And if you talk about sexuality in Hinduism, everyone is going to refer you to the Kama Sutra. It was originally known by the title Vatsyana's Aphorisms on Love. Vatsyana was the author. Like I said, somewhere around 400 BCE to 200 CE. It's a philosophical work. It's not just a sex manual, because it's referred to as the science of love. The science of love. And it was intended as both a psychological exploration of human desire, as well as a guide to sexual pleasure. So on the one hand, it was a guide to sexual pleasure, but on a deeper level, it's looking at the whole issue of desire as part of the human psyche. What it is, what it does, how it can be beneficial, how it can be damaging. The word kama means desire. Sutra means it's a part of a text. It literally means thread. But like you said, the Buddhist sutras, those are the sutras in any Buddhist text. This is a sutra about pleasure. But more than just pleasure. Pleasure from a psychological sense as well as a practical sense. It wasn't the only work. There were lots of these. We don't have them, though. But how do we know there were lots of these? There are other references. Okay, so we don't have those other texts, but even within the Kama Sutra, there are references to this. And it's quite likely that this text spread to China through Buddhist monks. Interesting. But not so strange when you think about it, because Buddhism is very interested in desire. Generally not from a pleasurable point of view, but the suffering that it can often bring. So it's not as unusual as one might think. And then, of course, once the British got there, the Europeans, you can go down to I don't know if the Bookworm has it, but you can surely order it. I mean, it's a very well-known text throughout the West as well. So let's take a little closer look. Kama is one of the 4 goals of the Hindu life. Unless you're an ascetic, and I'll get there. It means desire, including sexual desire, is okay. It's a part of life. It's one of the 4 ends. And sutra, I said, literally means thread. Metaphorically, it refers to a collection of aphorisms that took the form of a manual. This is the Kama Sutra. But contrary to, now if I say Kama Sutra to most people, all they're going to think about is sexual positions. Okay, because the Kama Sutra goes into a lot of these. But it's, like I said, that's a very small part of it. It presents itself as a guide to virtuous and gracious living, mainly for aristocrats or court people who had lots of leisure time at court. So it's a type of manual rather than just a sex giving all the various positions, etc. And it discusses the nature of love, for example. Not just sex, but love, desire, family life, because all these things are part of kama. And these are legitimate in the Hindu tradition. You want to get over them eventually, because you want to get off this. But at a certain stage of life, these are valid. Only about 20% of the entire work refers to sexual positions. Most of it is not about that. The majority of the book is a philosophy, the theory of love, and this is what triggers desire and what sustains it. And that's an interesting question. What is it that arouses desire in someone? I'm not going to answer that for you, but you can take it home and think about it. What is it that causes desire to arise? So there's a lot of reflection on this within this text. And what sustains it? What keeps it going? And then what ends it? And how and when desire and love can either be positive or negative in their application. We tend to think of love as always positive, right? They will look at love as also having negative sides, especially if it becomes possessive and addictive. And if when you say, I love you, it means I love the fact that you love me. So it looks at love, it looks at these things at a fairly deep level. And like I said, in the opening preface, the author cites other texts. So this was something that leisurely wealth brought about the ability to reflect on. Peasants working in the fields every day aren't going to come home and sit down and reflect on these. This is a leisurely reflection by an aristocratic class. Very similar to Versailles, Europe. Has anyone seen the movie Dangerous Liaisons? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so it has a total of 1,250 verses with 36 chapters. So it's not a small work, which are then divided into 7 sections. And according to Wendy Doniger, who's one of the major Indologists in the United States. She's at Emory University and Harvard as well. She translated it, and according to her, the contents are broken down as follows. First, starts with just general remarks. Okay, 5 chapters on what the book is about. Then the 3 aims and priorities of life. If I told you or asked you what are the 3 aims of life, you might think what you would say. Well, the Kama Sutra says 1 is pleasure, 1 is duty, and 1 is liberation from all this. Once you go through the first 2 stages, then you will be ready. But in the first 2, okay, that's part of life. That's part of the life cycle. Okay? And Kama is a legitimate one. So that's it discusses this in detail. Then this is still under general remarks, the acquisition of knowledge and conduct of the well-bred aristocrat. Okay, how he should act, proper manners. Does anyone know what that word means anymore? No. Okay. Proper manners. Not only around a woman, but in general. How should you act? It spends a lot of time talking about things like that. And then some on what they call the intermediaries who can assist you in your various enterprises. Meaning someone who might introduce you to the proper lady, someone who might arrange a marriage for the family. These intermediaries, which used to be very prominent in most cultures, we sort of don't have those anymore. You know, your son comes home or your daughter says, I've met this guy, or I've met this girl, we're going to get married. Oh yeah? Okay. Traditionally, there would all be someone who would sort of, what's the proper fit here? So anyway, it talks a lot about that too. So that's the first section. Then the second is on amorous advances and the sexual union. Now we get down to a little bit of the nitty-gritty. 10 chapters on desire. 10 chapters examining desire. Its origins, its continuation, all these things. 10 chapters. Then it gets more specific. Types of embraces, types of kisses, types of positions. Well, I'll show you a couple, but I won't keep it on too long. I know there's a lot of you are kind of bashful. Then an interesting part, virile behavior in women. The recognition that women have virile behavior, not just males. So it talks about this, and it suggests to the male how that should be dealt with or accommodated. So what's important here is sexuality isn't just about the male having pleasure. It's about both. And then it talks about various games of love. Yeah. What we call fantasies, I guess. Yeah. In this section, this is where you find the 64 types of that. I'm not going to show. When we get to the Khajuraho temples, I'll show you a couple carvings. And I'll warn you ahead of time, so if you don't want to look, you can look down. But I just got to. Okay, so then we're not done. The third section, acquiring a wife. Acquiring a wife, which includes the means of obtaining one as well as various forms of marriage. We will see that in India today, you have two basic forms. One is become traditional, which is the arranged marriage, which became dominant in the Middle Ages and is carried forth. But then you have love marriage, which you find today in India mainly amongst the middle liberated, westernized classes. But I'll talk more about that later. Duties and privileges of the wife. 2 chapters on the conduct of only one wife, as well as how do you deal with more than one. 6 chapters on the behaviors of a woman and a man, such as how to get acquainted, how to get to know each other. It's sort of like a dating manual. Then there's about courtesans. And this has chapters on how to choose a lover, etc., etc. So what I want to get across here is this isn't just a bunch of pictures. It's a very in-depth text, which has its philosophical structure, it's practical, and then it's sensual. And they're all sort of woven together. Let me give you an example. I'll read from one of the chapters. This is on called Chapter 10. Of the way to begin and how to end what they call Congress. Congress is another word for intercourse. Okay, it's not how to, not, anyway. So, in the pleasure room. Okay, first of all, you have a pleasure room. This is very aesthetic. Okay, it's an aesthetic text. Decorated with flowers and fragrance with perfumes. The citizen should receive the woman who will come bathed and dressed and will invite her to take refreshment and to drink freely. He should then seat her on his side, holding her hair, touching also the end of the knot of her garment. He should gently embrace her with his right arm. They should then carry on an amusing conversation on various subjects and may also talk suggestively of things which would be considered as coarse if not done properly. They may sing together and play on musical instruments. Talk about the arts. This is very much like the geisha tradition in Japan. So what the point here is, sex isn't just an act. It's a whole contextual way of being with another person. And persuade each other. At last, when the woman is overcome with love and desire, the citizen should dismiss the people that may be with him, giving them flowers, ointments, betel leaves, and when the two are left alone, they should proceed, as has already been described in earlier chapters. No, I'm not. This is going out to I got to watch myself here. At the end of the Congress, okay. Now, okay, this is. Okay. The lovers with modesty and not looking at each other should go separately to the washing room. After this, sitting in their own places, they should eat some betel leaves. If you've ever been to betel leaves, they chew them and it gets all the red, you spit it, okay? It's sort of a bit of a stimulant. It's almost like people who would put tobacco. Yeah, it's sort of a stimulant. He should then embrace her with his left arm and with agreeable words should cause her to drink from a cup held in his own hand. And it just goes on and on. And so it builds up slowly, and it goes down slowly. So that's what I would emphasize here. It's seen as an entire process, not just. Okay. So I want to now move to a bit of eroticism as found in these famous temples at Khajuraho. These are, as you can see on the map, in northern Madhya Pradesh. It's a whole series of temples. I believe there are about 70 of them, constructed between 950 and 1050 CE by the Chandela dynasty. And they have all sorts of examples of artwork on them. The vast majority just depict aspects of daily life, mythical stories from the epics, etc. So 85 to 90% of all the sculpture is not erotic, but you have about 10% being very erotic. When the British missionaries came across these, they thought these were demonic. But let me say, I'll try and explain these in a way that are not only physical but spiritual from the tradition's point of view. Okay, I'm going to just show you one. Only do these if you're in very good shape. Okay, but these are examples of various erotic. Now, the Kama Sutra has 64 of these, so I'll get past that. But like I said, they're only 20%, and they're believed to be representative of what is called tantric or tantrism. So, what is tantrism? Tantrism is an ancient Indian tradition of beliefs, meditation, and ritual that seeks to channel what they call the divine energy of the cosmos, or the Godhead, into human consciousness. The notion that the cosmos is energy, which is interesting because that's what physics eventually comes down to. Everything is energy at some level. So the tantric goal is how do you take cosmic energy and combine it with your own energy. And it has all sorts of rituals, beliefs, meditative practices designed to do this. And this energy is called prana, Prana. And this is what Tantrism focuses on. How do you get your own prana to mesh with the universal prana? And there are a number of techniques that are used as aids, and one of these is sexual. It's called metuna. And here you see the example on the right is what is called yobyom. There's the male god, and notice the female god sitting on top. Now, this is meant to represent the masculine, feminine energies of the universe coming together. And human beings, I don't say mimic this, but in a sense mimic this in their own sexuality. So human sexuality is a type of mimicking of the divine meshing of male-female principles. That's what Tantrism is all about. Now, generally these are seen to be symbolic. Okay? They're not meant to, the ritual doesn't actually include sexual intercourse. Asterisk. There have been examples, okay, of certain subsects that would use that. But generally speaking, Tantrism is symbolic of how do you bring your male and female energies that you have within your body together. How do you bring those together? Not only with another person, but within yourself. And Buddhist monks practice Tantrism. Again, just symbolic, not actual. And many of the scriptures, the Tantric scriptures, warn that unless this is seen as a spiritual act, it will become carnal and sinful. Okay, so this is the recognition. This is supposed to be symbolic of the two energies of the universe coming together, which in marriage is what man and wife do. It's the two energies of the universe. What, Chris?
It's like the yin and yang.
Yeah, yin and yang coming together. Yin and yang coming together. Symbols for this, again, go back to all the way back. We find this back at the Hindu civilization. Okay, these two. It's called the lingam and the yoni. The phallic symbol, the female symbol coming together to bring about a connection. So I think this is really important in Hinduism. The connection, although it's practiced physically, because we're physical beings, that's just the vehicle to the connection. It's the connection of the male and the female principles in the universe that become important. So the union of the lingam and the yoni represents what is called the indivisible two-in-oneness. The two-in-oneness of the male and the female. And here we find the idea of what is known as the feminine power of the Shakti. And that's what all the goddesses in Hinduism, that's why there are so many goddesses. Hindu culture recognized the power of the feminine in all ways of life, especially religiously. Okay. Some scholars see these images in religious terms. Others claim their erotic arts are part of the tradition and it's just showing kama as part of life. This writer I should have mentioned Kali. Kali is a feminine power. Okay, she's one of these goddesses. She's a feminine power. But she has an ambiguous side to her. That's why she has all the... What do you notice around her neck? Skulls. Okay, skulls. What is that all about? The mother goddess gives, but the mother goddess takes away. The mother goddess gives birth, but once something is born, it inevitably will die. We don't think of it that way often, do we? But once you're born, you're on the road to death. That's part of the life cycle. Yeah, and one of the phrases that's sometimes used in some Buddhist texts is, when you're born, it's like having a rope around your neck. And you are at free fall. You just don't know when it's going to snap. And if you think about it, that's a pretty good, you can deny it. So these two, so Kali gives, but Kali taketh. So the goddess can be seen as dangerous sometimes. But the important part is what she really takes at the spiritual level is your ego, which must die in Hinduism to attain liberation. So that's what Kali is all about. This James, his story of the Kama Sutra entitled The Book of Love is an English variation on all the things we've been talking about, in case you want to go out and buy it. I don't know. But okay, now, that's the one side. On the extreme other side, there is Hindu asceticism. What is an ascetic? An ascetic is a person who gives up all the pleasures of life, including sex. Why? Because they're seen to be hindrances to liberation. They keep you attached to this world. This isn't so unusual. You see this in Christian monasticism, right? There's, on the one hand, there's the wealthy bishops, and they're not supposed to be fooling around, but we know some of the popes had wives. And on the other hand, you have the St. Francis's. So it's a wide boat, most of these religions. And in Hinduism, an ascetic is called a sadhu, a mendicant or holy person. He's renounced the worldly life. In fact, his family will hold a funeral for him. They will have funeral rites because he doesn't, and what does he do with his life? He wanders. He wanders. When you go to India, you'll often come across these gentlemen, and they take alms, etc. Yeah, Chris?
That looks like a very lost sadhu.
Well, there are sadhus, and then there are sadhus.
It wasn't weird.
What about this one?
Yeah, that's more like someone
Yeah. He's covered in ashes. What are ashes a symbol of? Death. Because when you're put on the pyre, so again, this is a tradition, long-standing tradition, in which it says that sexuality is a no-no. But it's not for everyone. It's for certain people. It's for sadhus, those who feel, because remember, Hinduism believes in reincarnation. So once you've had 5,000 lives and all the sex you want, you might say, enough. I've had enough. In fact, I've had enough of all of this, and I want to be liberated. So I'm liberated by living a lifestyle that removes me from this.
Can you come back from that?
Can you come back in the next life?
Well, in this life?
No, once you become, it would be sort of like becoming a priest and then giving up your priestly vows. I mean, I guess it can be done, but it's just culturally, it would be. Now, this is equal opportunity. There are also sadhvis, not as many as sadhus, but these are female sadhus known as sadhvis. And the sadhu's life is solely dedicated to achieving what is known as moksha, liberation from the cycle of death.
In both this picture and the one of the man, there's that triangle, almost triangular.
Yeah, that's the sign of Shiva.
Oh, that's the Shiva.
That's the Shiva sign. Okay, that's the Shiva sign. It's the trident. Okay, Shiva often carries the trident. Yeah. So, most sadhus tend towards worshiping Shiva, but you find others as well. But I wanted to bring this out because it shows you in this tradition, the vastness of attitudes towards sex. And many young boys feel a calling towards this. A lot of early on sadhus would go into these orders at the age of 15, 16. Now, what becomes interesting in terms of sexual morality for especially the middle classes in India is when the British come. When the British come and take over politically, and they have very different attitudes towards sexuality than some of the things we've been talking about in traditional Hinduism, or the Kama Sutra, for example. And what they attempted to do, as they saw it as their world mission, not only to convert, but to make these people moral. And that meant Victorian morality. So they tried to impose on many of the middle-class Hindus a Victorian sense of morality. where you don't even look at the body. If you ever read anything about Victorian texts, sex was done with clothes on. Okay, it was because just seeing the body would arouse desire. I don't know, but anyway, do you ever read or see the French Lieutenant's Woman, a famous novel? It looks at those. In any case, what we find is that there are a lot of reform movements within middle class and upper class Hinduism, which try and now bring Victorian morality to the people. And they had quite an impact. So that even today, you would say that Indian sexuality is extremely conservative. Extremely conservative. It starts that conservative path during the British period. Okay, let's move to marriage. Has anyone ever been to a Hindu wedding? Wow, they are magnificent affairs. Especially even if you can't afford them. That's one of the problems. If a father is marrying a daughter, he has to give her a pretty elaborate marriage, even if he's poor. So how does he do that? He goes into debt. There's so many poor Indian families in debt because of marriage. But in any case, a Hindu marriage, it's known as vivaha in Sanskrit, is one of the most important rites of passage. It's described in the legal texts. Variously defined, generally described to be an institution for the establishment and regulation of a proper relationship between the sexes. That's what marriage is. It's a proper relationship between the sexes with the goal of producing children. It's a sacrament. It's a sacrament. It's not so it's a very religious notion. It's not a social contract. It's a sacrament, as it is in the Catholic Church. Several scriptures state that a man is only said to be complete after marrying a woman. I think we saw that in Judaism as well, this idea of completion. Now, for most of Indian history, and this includes today, except amongst perhaps the wealthy and the upper middle classes, women were seen as subservient to the will of her father. So, who decides who you're going to marry? Traditionally, it will be your father. You really don't have much say in the matter. And that she is then meant, when she is married, not to be the property of her father, but the property of her husband. And this is still held by many in India today, especially in rural India. Thus, the main duty of a girl's parents was and is to arrange her marriage. And after marriage, a woman is only seen as a guest in her parents' home. She can come home and visit as a guest, but she is now her husband's, I guess you could say, property, or member of that family. And the way Indian families work, often they're joint families, means that there's not just a nuclear family, so you'll have, let's say, a grandfather, a grandmother, and the son will marry and bring his wife into the family. The third son down the line, the third girl brought into the family. So there's a real pecking order here. Okay? It's generally not seen to be a good thing to be brought into a family where you're the youngest bride. In any case, things are changing, but this is very much part of the tradition. The bride's family was and is expected to pay for the wedding. And these are very lavish affairs. Also, there's a dowry. you remember, I think I mentioned in Islam, they reversed it? Well, in India, it's the girl's family who has to pay the dowry. Jewelry is one of the common things. You know, pots and pans, even land among the more wealthy. However, in 1961, there was a Dowry Prohibition Act, and that's the law. But then there's the law, and then there's custom. You can have laws, but often customs go against it. So the dowry is still very dominant. Why would you pass a law against the dowry? Because it put so many people in debt. It put people in debt.
Daughters are in real trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't want to have a lot of daughters. Yeah, I think I told you before, I met a guy in India who had 7 daughters. That means he's looking at 7 marriages and 7 dowries. And he said to me, I know I did something wrong in my last life. Yeah. I mean, how else would you explain it? So, yeah, so this is, now it is changing to some degree, especially amongst the middle classes, but traditions die hard, especially in rural areas. So along with arranged marriage, which is tradition, there's something been called love marriage. Love marriage, and we find examples of this going all the way back to the epics and the Kama Sutra, so it's existed. It differs from arranged marriage in that the couple, rather than the parents, choose their own partner. And that the consent of their parents is not required for marriage. That's a love marriage. This is the type of thing you'll see depicted in Bollywood films. You know, but usually the 2 lovers are fighting against the tradition. They want to get married. But tradition says no because she's of lower caste. So it's a really good field for filmmaking because it brings up all these tensions. Hindu literature indicates that love marriage were always recognized, but especially during the Middle Ages, the medieval period, arranged marriage became dominant. And this is one reason they think that this was after the Muslim invasions. This was one way of making sure that your daughter stayed Hindu. You would arrange her marriage at an early age. Okay? Now, you could arrange the marriage at 3. That didn't mean it was that the 2 lived together or that there was coming together. That was only allowed after a certain age. So the young girl would live with her family until that time came, but she was already betrothed. Same with the boy. So that's what arranged marriage was. Now it's interesting. In contemporary India, there's been a rise in love marriages. What do the conservatives say why? The West. The West brought all this stuff in, and look what's happening to all our youth. Okay? But it's becoming more and more dominant. Although what tends to happen is the family will find 3 or 4 suitable and then invite them to meet each other. If you've ever seen the movie Namesake, that's a good movie to see that. And then they will hopefully agree. And so it's become sort of both for those who have any modern impulse. But again, in the villages, pretty much arranged. But this is interesting. In a 2012 survey, now this is 13 years ago, 74 of the respondents said they preferred arranged marriage. I found that when I was in India in 1980, the family, when I was doing a research project there, and we had a very good friend of mine who actually had been a next-door neighbor at UCLA, and Dr. Jory, an Indian, and we were visiting his family, and we got to know his daughter and her girlfriends. So I asked them about arranged marriage versus love marriage. They all thought arranged marriage was better. And I asked them why. I said, because we don't have to sell ourselves. we trust our parents will find someone. And I think it was Shruti, who was very shrewd, said, in the West, you fall in love, then you get married. Here, we get married, and then we learn to love. Which is an interesting idea. In other words, marriage is much bigger than just my and the two people's feelings. Because we know, well, and they would also point out and say, why do you have such a high divorce rate? Because what happens to feelings? Especially romantic feelings. They go. So, it's interesting. So I would back up that this survey that a lot of young girls and boys would prefer arranged marriages. Because a marriage is about family, not about extended family, not just about two people. And in a 2014 survey conducted by the United Nations Population Fund, only 11% of the men and 8% of the women claimed that they chose their own partners. Okay? So they needed family consent. So while the vast majority of Hindus continue to have arranged marriages, the prospective spouses usually have more agency than in the past. They have some, we're not talking about rural now, but urban families generally will allow the boys and girls to meet. Traditionally, you know when they first met? At the wedding ceremony. They never saw each other. Because physical attraction wasn't seen to be that what was important. It was family connection. Okay, let me just conclude with a few words about Buddhism, because so original Buddhism, that's going back to the time of the Buddha, categorized sexuality, particular sexual arousal, as something that should be avoided. Mainly because the early Buddhist communities were monastic. Okay, it wasn't for the population as a whole. It was to be avoided because what did it do? It kept you attached. So that aspect of Buddhism came out of this ascetic side of the larger Indian tradition. And the Buddha in some of the texts says there's three objects of craving. The craving for existence, the craving for non-existence, and the craving for sensual pleasure. Kama is identified as one of the 5 hindrances to liberation. One of the 5 hindrances to liberation. And it's a cause of suffering. Here it says, if one, longing for sensual pleasure, achieves it, yes, he's enraptured at heart. The mortal gets what he wants. But if for that person the pleasure is diminished, he's shattered as if shot with an arrow. The unrequited love. I mean, love does a lot of positive things, but it causes a lot of pain. It causes a lot of pain. So the Buddha generally saw this as a bit of a trap. And he goes on, so one always mindful should avoid sensual desires, letting them go. He will cross over the flood, like one who, having bailed out of a boat, has reached the far shore. The flood refers to human suffering. The far shore is nirvana, or liberation. Now, like I said, you have to understand this in context. The early teachings are applied to monastics. They all took vows of celibacy, still do. If you become a Buddhist monk, you take a vow of celibacy. And these were watched very closely in the monastery. However, once religion starts to spread, and once lay people start becoming followers, well, you can't demand celibacy. So what has tended to happen over time is that Buddhism has accepted sexuality within the marriage institution. It's supposed to be, however, you don't get addicted, even within marriage. You don't let yourself get overly attached to sensual pleasure. Enjoy it for what it is, but also see it for what it is. This is, I'll finish with, here's a passage from a Western Buddhist, because as Buddhism has come to the West, it's really had to try and adapt a little bit to Western lifestyles. You're not going to get a lot of followers going to a Buddhist Sangha requiring celibacy or requiring non-enjoyment but so this is what he says in talking about sexuality in Buddhism, in contemporary Western Buddhism. There is in the Buddhist view nothing uniquely wicked about sexual offenses or failings. Those inclined to develop a guilt complex about their sex life should realize that failure in this respect is neither more nor, on the other hand, less serious than failure to live up to any other precept. Firstly, in common with all the other precepts, it is a rule of training. It is not a commandment from God or the Buddha or anyone else. It's not a thou shalt not. There are no such commandments in Buddhism. Rather, it is an undertaking by you to yourself to do your best to observe a certain type of restraint because you understand that it is a good thing to do, and without doing it, you cause suffering. That's the Buddhist view, you see. It always comes back to, are you causing suffering? Are your actions causing suffering? And if they aren't, well and good. But the point is, often, especially in an open society, sexual actions end up causing great suffering. So it's always, when you're teaching Buddhist teachings in an open society, it's always this notion, restraint, see it for what it is. According to the doctrine he taught, freedom from suffering involves freedom from overt desire. And the training to get rid of craving involves, to a great extent, abstaining from those desires. So it's generally, he sums up, the guide here is do no harm. If what you are doing sexually is causing no harm, no problem. If it's causing harm, either physically or psychologically or socially, that's when it becomes dangerous. All right, next week I'm going to look specifically at homosexuality in all of the various traditions, and that will end this series. And then I believe there'll be a break, and I think Reverend Elbert is going to give a couple classes related to his pilgrimage. And after that, we have online famous women. Famous women. I'm going to do a religious individual, Simone Weil. I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
Say that again.
Simone Weil, W-E-I-L. Eleanor Roosevelt. And the young girl, Pakistani girl who won the Nobel Prize